Hello guys, this is me Simu Orahara, and in this video I will talk about the path of Ichigo Kurosaki in the last arc of Bleach. As a start, I can say that Ichigo's path in the last arc, and especially in the second half of the last arc, was one of the worst things that happened not only in that arc but rather in the whole story of Bleach. You may ask me why. I will tell you that Kubo was going smoothly and creatively in analyzing, interpreting and revealing the powers of Ichigo. He was walking in a progressive line when he reached the climax of the events and revealed Ichigo's powers and how they work. Suddenly he had a free fall. The manga ended with a catastrophic end. Of course, we heard discussion the events of the story. We know that Kobo was suffering in his last years making Bleach, but I think even with that obstacle, Kobo had a chance to give Ichigo some fights. So we will analyze together the course of Ichigo's events in the last arc, and you will get what I mean. So, in order to talk about Ichigo in the last arc, we must divide his path into several fundamental events. His first appearance in the chapter 480, his travel to the Wikomondo in his fight against Killua Oppi, in his first clash against Yhwach and the break of the Tensei Zangetsu, and his travel to the Royal Palace and revealing his true power. And it is precisely this point that divides the path of Ichigo in the story, meaning the Ichigo after chapter 542 is not the same as the one before. Then we finally come to the rest of his role after his strength was revealed and there was the shock and the fall. So in the beginning, when Ichigo appeared in the first chapter of the last arc, we only had informations from the previous events. For example, that Ichigo's power are concentrated in three sources, two main sources and another new source. The source of his Shinigami powers, and the second source is the Hollow powers, and the third source is the Fullbring powers. During that time, Ichigo was in a new situation in terms of Shikai and Bankai, and the conversations about Ichigo's power were dramatically growing, especially after that show he presented against Ginjo and in the beginning of the first chapters of the last arc. But when Ichigo went to the Wikomondo and fought Killua Oppi, it became apparent that Ichigo was not that strong, meaning it's true that his strength was increasing. However, Ichigo found difficulties with Killua, especially after he activated his ability and imprisoned him. At the same time, all of Kote 13 was counting on him to do something against this new villain that have no mercy. He destroyed the city and killed the old man. So the question arose, how will Ichigo face Yhwach when he barely crossed one of his followers? And we all saw the difference between Yhwach and Ichigo at that point. And here we get to the third point, which reshuffled the cards of Ichigo's power again, after it appeared that he had another power, the Quincy powers, through the activation of the Blood Vein, when Yhwach was trying to take him with him. And the reason for the awakening of his Quincy power at that moment, as Yhwach said, is because of Killgi's Ryatsu, who is a pure Quincy. Anyway, from that moment the new powers of Ichigo became the scope at that moment, in addition to what he had before. Of course, after Hashvalt broke the Tensei Zangetsu, we then entered one of the most beautiful chapters in Ichigo's path. The title of those chapters may be called Ichigo's self-exploration. Who am I? What are my real powers? This answer were what Nimaya wanted in order to fix Ichigo's Zanpakuto. And finally, the issue, as we know, did not stop at the reform of the Tensei Zangetsu, but revealing facts about Ichigo Kurosaki. And the answer to the question who am I was through a flashback of his father's past, and we learned that his mother was a Quincy. And the answer to what are my true powers was through the Osan revealing to Ichigo his identity and that he represents his Quincy powers, and that Shiro was his Shinigami powers, and that he was making Ichigo fight with a small amount of his true power. And I think you know the rest of the story because I talked about that previously. What is important and the main thing is that Ichigo became finally aware of his true self, and his powers no longer controlled him, and that he can now make his own decisions. And he also owns his own Zanpakuto, represented in two blades, a long blade that represents the Shinigami powers, and the other blade is the Quincy side of his powers, and they are both the same Zanpakuto named Zangetsu. And here, the beginning of the nightmare. Why a nightmare? Because throughout the story and up to the chapter 542, Ichigo wasn't fighting with his full power, except for the Dangai and Mugetsu mode in which I explained my opinion. With that exception, all of Ichigo's fights, he was fighting with a restriction of power. He was fighting without knowing how to use them. In the end, when he was able to fight with all of his strength, everyone became anxious to see Ichigo's fighting with his liberating powers. But Kobo surprised us with a strange behaviors with Ichigo during the second half of the last arc. So chapter 555 marked the return of Ichigo from the Royal Palace, and we don't know what kind of training he took there after owning a real Zanpakuto, but whatever is it, it wasn't enough. And this was confirmed later and we will talk about it. So I said, great, Ichigo is returning now to the battlefield and will finally fight. I thought that Ichigo would face a very powerful generator and it would be a legendary fight with memories of Ichigo's fight against Illichura. And then I told myself, no, this fight of Ichigo with Illichura will not be compared to the fight that this new Ichigo may have, and that we will find out his new abilities before the big battle against Yhwach. But surprisingly, Ichigo fights with Quincy girls, and it was not even a fight, just a little skirmish, in which we learned that Ichigo had now a magnificent Shimpo and a new technique, a result of using the Getsuga Tensho with the two blades. Then Kobo will go into a lost spiral in many chapters. I'm talking here about the chapters that relate to the preparation for Ichigo's return to the Royal Palace after Yhwach ascended there. Kobo wasted many chapters in the preparation of Ichigo and the Goty 13 to go to the Royal Palace, with no use, especially many Goty members went to the Royal Palace and they had no role. Even when Ichigo returned to the Royal Palace and met Yhwach, all the events of those chapters had nothing except Ichigo catching the Soul King. Okay, we want now a fight for Ichigo with his new powers. Kobo doesn't want to. Then he enters us in a chapters of the speech struggle of Ichigo and Yoryu, to the point that half of the chapter back then were just conversations that had no effect on the story, and it ended with the fall of Ichigo and those with him to the bottom of the Soul Palace. And again, Kobo takes almost 3 chapters only to explain to you how Ichigo will return again to the Soul Palace using the powers of Yukio and Riruka. And even with all of this, and after Ichigo's return to the Soul Palace for the 3rd time, he found that Yhwach had turned it into his own kingdom. Kobo had many chances to get Ichigo to fight one of the elite guards, but Kobo once again made Ichigo fall in front of Asuke. Kobo continued wasting chapters and chapters. He only decides to focus on Ichigo until about 10 chapters before the end of the manga. Suddenly Kobo decides that Ichigo has to fight and show us his strength in 10 chapters, meaning from a short clash against Candice directly to another fight against Yhwach in order to finish the manga. Because however strong Ichigo has become, the events must be smooth in the progress of the hero towards the last enemy. Because the mistake that some people make is thinking that after the chapter 542 Ichigo has reached his highest level of strength. No, it's not like that. What Nimaya and the Osan did was just giving Ichigo the key to explore his total powers. Ichigo needs fights and other training in order to control and explore all of his power. And the proof is that even when he faced Yhwach with the mode of Horn of the Salvation, he himself admitted that he was still unable to control his powers. So Kobo had to prepare enemies for Ichigo to fight before fighting Yhwach. For example, Ichigo did not fight Illichura and Yami at the beginning of the Arankara arc and immediately after that moved to fight Aizen in a final battle. No, there was an evolution, and he fought Grimijo in several rounds, and after that he fought Illichura and he ended up fighting Aizen. And of course, I'm not saying that Kobo should follow exactly the same approach as the Arankara arc, because Ichigo's situation at that point is not the same as the last arc. But when the hero's strength is raised, you must also bring more powerful enemies to balance events and battles. And another thing, if you notice that in the first arc Ichigo went through several trainings to learn the basics of his Shinigami powers, and in the Arankara arc he was trained to control the powers of the Hollow. In the Fullbring arc, Kubo made several chapters where Ichigo was training to gain the powers of the Fullbring. So shouldn't Ichigo also have a special training with the Osan, but this time on his Quincy powers? Especially when we know that Yhwach, the most of his scenes with Ichigo, Yhwach was always talking about Ichigo's Quincy powers. Even after Ichigo owning a real Zanpakuto, his Quincy powers was the reason he was able to cut the Soul King. So I think in the last arc Ichigo had to go through another training of his Quincy power with the Osan. And I don't know at what stage Ichigo may take this training, but as an option, this training would have been, in my opinion, after fighting a very strong generator, meaning after his return from the Royal Palace. At that time, he would have at least won a good and complete fight for Ichigo with his real powers. And then after that, when he heads to the Royal Palace again, there Ichigo will cut off the Soul King because Yhwach has taken advantage of his Quincy side. Here Ichigo, he will ask himself, how should I prevent Yhwach from taking advantage of the blood bond that brings us together? And here the Osan will interfere again, but this time as a Quincy power to tell him that he must get acquainted with the secret of his Quincy powers and learn Quincy techniques that will be useful against Yhwach. It will be also a good opportunity for the Osan to tell us the story of Yhwach from the beginning, his origin in his relationship with the Soul King and his battle against Yamaji. So by showing the parts of that past and how Yhwach has defeated, we will have a clear vision of how he can be defeated again. So in the same period, Yhwach will have absorbed the Soul King and ascended the throne of Bleach, because even before he opened his eyes, Yhwach was able to control Yamato's Bankai and he was strong. He had the ability to share and recover parts of his soul, and after activating the power of the Almighty, he defeated the most powerful Shinigami, which is Ichibi, and with all that strength he became more powerful and absorbed the Soul King. Therefore, for the end to be logical, there should have been fights at least between the 5 weapons. For example, Ichibi after recovering his strength, and Aizen Sasuke without seals, and then Ichigo after the last training. There will be the final fight, which may be in stages. At first it will be collective, the 5 weapons against Yhwach with Ichigo using his Bankai, and then we see the real power of the Bankai and supported by Quincy techniques. And at some point Yuryu joins the battle, so it will be Ichigo and Yuryu against Yhwach, which ends with Ichigo's final release, taking advantage of certain circumstances that existed to activate that phase. In summary, I feel very sad that Kubo didn't give Ichigo more fights to discover his true power, especially after his power were revealed, but unfortunately didn't happen, and I hope it will be fixed in the anime. So what about you guys, and see you in my next video.